Hi, everybody. Today is Friday, April 18th, 2025, and our friends Colonel Wilkerson, Ambassador Chas Freeman, and Professor Marandi from Iran are back with us. Welcome back.
Good.
We will.
Thank you.
Let's get started, Ambassador, with what has happened in the first meeting between the American and Iranians in Oman. They were evaluating both parties. They were evaluating as positive, but you're witnessing that Witkov is just changing the rhetoric. Here is what he put on X, and he's talking about Iran must stop and eliminate its nuclear enrichment and weaponization program. This is totally different from what we've heard before from him. Even on Fox News, he was giving an interview. He was talking with Fox News on Fox News. How do you see the way that Witkov is trying to change the rhetoric?
Well, I think we talked about the fact that the administration is divided against itself. Mr. Trump and Mr. Vance have certain views. Secretary of State Rubio and Michael Waltz, the National Security Advisor, and some others are classic neoconservatives. And so the government is not speaks with many voices. But I think what happened in Muscat was that Arabchi, the Iranian foreign minister, proposed to roll back the situation to where it was in about 2015. That is, Iran would agree to retreat from the high level of enrichment that it has since been engaged in, go back to 3.7% perhaps, readmit the inspectors, perhaps they would even improve the inspection regime, and give commitments which are easy for Iran because it apparently has not made a decision to build a bomb, even though it is close to being able to do so. Go back to that. And I think Mr. Witkoff basically accepted that. And then he went back to Washington, and word arrived probably from Jerusalem directly to the president. You got to stop this agreement. So he did. And so now he's back to the original demand that Mike Waltz articulated, which is a total ban on any nuclear program at all. I didn't notice in this latest statement anything about destroying air defenses and missiles and so forth, but I wouldn't be surprised if that were in there too. So this is not acceptable to Iran, and it's not a formula to go forward. And it is a reminder that it was Mr. Trump in his first presidency who canceled that nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, much on, I think Iran would be taking a big risk to accept Mr. Trump's word for anything. Maybe it's prepared to do so, but not in these terms where the negotiator says one thing one day and then the next day takes back what he said. So this is, I think, a pretty good indication of what some of us have suspected, namely the Trump administration doesn't know what it's doing and doesn't know how to do consistent diplomacy. It's not good.
Professor Marandi, your take, and how does Iran perceive that?
Obviously, it's a sign, as Chaz pointed out, that the administration is speaking with many voices. And this is not unique when it comes to US foreign policy or Trump's foreign policy, because we see the same thing with China and the tariff war. We see it with other countries, again, regarding the tariffs that they've imposed on them. And of course, we also hear mixed messages when it comes to Ukraine. So it's hard to really figure out what's happening, but it's not a good sign. I agree completely. The Iranians are willing to carry out a deal. We almost had a deal 3 years ago. when Dr. Balkari was negotiating in Vienna. I was there, as I was with also Dr. Zarif in 2015. We reached a final text, but ultimately Biden was unable to agree to it, even though the Europeans accepted that text. Uh, I think that tomorrow will probably give us a clearer indication of where the United States wants to go. Either they want to uh, kick the can down the road for a few more weeks, or they're going to go back to what Witkoff was saying on Fox News. But if it's what he's written on X, then that's not a good sign because the Iranians are not going to accept uh, halting the enrichment of uranium. It's a sovereign right of Iran, and Iran does not have a nuclear weapons program either. So Witkoff's shifting position, I think, leaves Iranians baffled because a week ago tomorrow, people were optimistic. Although I think that the people in charge were telling people not to be very optimistic. Ayatollah Khamenei, he said, I'm not optimistic. And so we shouldn't be optimistic or we shouldn't be too optimistic or too pessimistic. We should get on with business as usual and let the negotiators do the negotiating. I think, though, that the trip by the son of King Salman and the Minister of Defense to Tehran was an important trip. He was supposed to be here last week, but he was ill, so it was postponed for a week. Now, so because there are different interpretations about timing, and I, I thought that's an important point to keep in mind. But I think it does show that Saudi Arabia wants to improve relations, and that there are issues that Saudi Arabia and Iran can resolve together. It makes things more difficult for the United States if Saudi, and for Israel, of course, if Saudi-Iranian relations improve. And I'm sure it's also a concern, the situation for Saudi Arabia, because if there's conflict in the region, then that will have a huge impact on oil supplies, gas supplies. If the United States starts bombing Iran, uh, I think the whole region, uh, everything in the region will change. One thing, though, that I should remind your audience, and that is that a U.S. strike on Iran uh, is not simple. It's not something that can easily be carried out. If they do not use any of the bases in the region, they have to fly from Diego Garcia. And that is a complicated mission. It's far, the planes are very large, uh, they need escorts. Those escorts will have problems getting close to Iran's borders, those uh, aircraft carriers. And bombing strikes against Iran would have very limited impact. If the United States really wants to get into a fight with Iran, they'd have to bring in, I guess, a million and a half soldiers. They'd have to mobilize their resources from across the world, of the Pacific, the Americas, Africa. Everything would have to be gathered here. I don't see that happening. And the world has changed. The rivals of the United States are much stronger today. Uh, the United States does not have the resources and the ability to to spend such money at a time when the economy is not doing well, and I think uh, the trade wars are also going to make it more difficult. So, if the United States bombs Iran, that bombing campaign would not be like Iraq or anything like that, but Iran's response would be very severe because Iran has, I think, probably 300 or so underground missile bases, drone bases across the country, and they've been at making advances and uh, bringing in new technology on a regular basis. They're working on their air defenses to prepare themselves for something big. We saw the major maneuvers that were carried out over the past 2-3 months. So I don't think it will end well for the United States. And the very fact that, according to reports, the US Secretary of Defense did not want, even though he's a hawk, he does not advocate conflict. I think it's probably because people in the know are telling him that this is not a good idea. And I think Tucker Carlson's tweet, too, is probably linked to his connections within the military establishment. But then again, a declining United States may wish, a declining empire may wish to lash out when things are not going well. And then you have the Zionist lobby, on the other hand, that's pushing. You have a deep divide in Israel, a very dangerous divide in Israel. Netanyahu needs to expand the war, to continue the war in order to remain in power. And there's even talk that there could be a deadly internal strife in Palestine. So there are many variables. I don't know any answers, but I don't think that any military conflict between Iran and the United States would end well for the United States. It wouldn't end well for anyone, but I think it would be a defeat for the United States, militarily speaking.
Ambassador, do you want to add something?
Yeah, just 2 quick points. First, I agree with Professor Marandi. The Khalid bin Salman's visit to Tehran and meeting with the Ayatollah Khamenei is a very important development. He carried a letter from King Salman proposing a broad pattern of cooperation, the details of which remain unknown, but very clearly sending the defense minister to Tehran has symbolic significance, particularly in light of the threats by the United States to attack Iran. The second point I'd make is, and I think Larry may be able to add more context here, is that apparently President Trump brushed aside Prime Minister Netanyahu's demands for a joint attack on Iran. And therefore the president has wanted, I'm not sure what the correct verb is, a deal with Iran. Unfortunately, he's surrounded by people who appear not to want a deal, but to want military action.
Larry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say I can't differ majorly, if at all, with anything that's been said. But I would say I would focus on, for us anyway, and for the situation in general, the fact that, as Doug McGregor said, when you invite clowns to town, all you have is a circus. That's the problem. We don't have a diplomatic instrument right now. We have a president who vacillates all over the board from hour to hour, and not just on Iran, but on Ukraine, which is becoming a much bigger problem, I think, even than Iran, unless we do, in fact, decide to bomb them. And then I agree with the professor there that we're going to get our ass handed to us in good military language. So the problem is in Washington. And it's getting deeper every day. It's getting more profound domestically with regard to rights of Americans under our own Constitution. It's getting more profound with regard to what he's doing to the bureaucracy, even the aspects of the bureaucracy that, I would stand up as a Republican and support 100%. He's firing heads of agencies. He's disrupting things. I found out yesterday he just Musk got a hold of, someone for Musk got a hold of the entire Selective Service System records. Now, what's he doing with that? What the heck does he need that for? And what's he going to do? One of the things he's going to find out is there's probably only about 60% of the 18 to 24-year-olds in America that are registered for the draft. So that ought to be a wake-up call, but it won't, because he won't even know what he's looking at. That's my deep concern right now. If I were the foreign minister of Iran, and I walked into that room, I understand they're going to be direct talks now, translators, and I had the first words other than pleasantries, I would say, I understood what you said last week, but I've seen this. Which is the case? And if he said the latter is the case, I'd get up and leave. I wouldn't stay.
Well, there's something of that happening in the Ukraine context with
Yes,
a
yes.
petulant statement by Marco Rubio upon leaving Paris that, if we can't solve this in the next few days, we're just going to walk away, thus demonstrating our irrelevance while having picked a fight with our allies in Europe. So, yes, people do walk away from things sometimes.
How about that for diplomacy? If we can't do it in 3 days, 3 days.
Exactly.
It's not even clear, I think, what he means by we may walk away. Walk away from Russia, walk away from Ukraine, walk away from the conflict, give more weapons to Ukraine. It's not clear what he's saying. It's sort of reflective to me of everything that's happening in the United States right now.
Yes.
I don't know where the trade war is going to go. I don't know where the war in Ukraine is going to go. I have no idea what tomorrow is going to be discussed between Iran and the United States. I don't know if they're going to be direct negotiations, but it doesn't matter what exactly is going to happen. So if he's going to walk away from Ukraine and then walk away, from the conflict and walk away from the negotiations at some point, if they're going to continue with their maximalist approach, all they're doing is isolating the United States further, pushing Iran, Russia, China, and others closer to each other, and marginalizing the United States.
Yep.
Here is what Marco Rubio said, Ambassador, about Iran.
Continue and that they're fruitful and that they can lead to something. We would all prefer a peaceful resolution and a lasting one. It has to be something that actually not just prevents Iran from having a nuclear weapon now, but in the future as well, not just for 10 years with some sort of sunset provision or the like. So we discussed that, obviously, because the Europeans, the E3, have a decision to make on snapback. Because I believe we should all anticipate, based on the public comments yesterday, that they're about to get a report from the IAEA that says not just is Iran out of compliance, but Iran is dangerously close to a weapon, closer than they've ever been. And then, they're going to have to make a decision about whether they want to reimpose these sanctions. And, if Iran is out of compliance, they have to reimpose the sanctions. So that's going to be a factor in all this, and that's why it was important we talked to them about it before our talks on Saturday. All right?
Ambassador, does he?
He almost said in perpetuity. And then the little bit of diplomat in him, the tiny little infinitesimal aspect of diplomacy in him said, "Oh, don't say that."
Well, basically what he is demanding is perpetual subjugation of Iran and surrender of Iranian sovereignty, which is clearly a non-starter. And it doesn't do any good to articulate that kind of thing in public. There's another element here, and that is, I wouldn't be so sure about the Europeans. I don't think they share the American devotion to Mr. Netanyahu and his effort to emasculate Iran. I don't know how they'll come out. I mean, they have no particular reason at present to feel an obligation to ingratiate themselves with Donald Trump. So we'll see.
It's not something new, Professor Marandi, because we know when Donald Trump decided to withdraw from JCPOA, Mike Pompeo and Bolton did everything for these snapback sanctions. They put a lot of pressure on Europeans. It seems that Marco Rubio is feeling in the same position that Mike Pompeo was trying to do. And right now he feels that he can achieve that.
Well, Trump was incompetent and so was Pompeo, because when Trump left the JCPOA, he automatically lost the right to push for the snapback, because he was no longer part of the P5+1, and therefore he couldn't move to initiate the process for the snapback. So he had to rely on the Europeans, or they had to rely on the Europeans. But I think the snapback really isn't that important. It's not first of all, it's not as important as it was a decade ago, because the world is changing. And in addition to that, all of the sanctions that would be put back in place as a result of the snapback, going back to the UN Security Council resolutions against Iran, all of those are all of those areas are already Iran is already sanctioned in all of them. The United States and the Europeans have sanctioned Iran, and they're sanctioning, and they will sanction countries that cooperate with Iran in all those areas that are in the UN Security Council resolutions. And in addition to that, look at North Korea now. North Korea is sanctioned, but the Russians are ignoring the sanctions. So UN Security Council resolutions nowadays don't carry the weight that they did a decade and a half ago. So I don't think that if there is a snapback and then those resolutions are revived, and I think it was a mistake by the Iranian side to allow for the snapback provision in the first place, and this just, I think, reinforces the narrative of those forces in Iran who want to take a more assertive stance that we cannot deal with the West, and that negotiating with the West is useless because Iran is in compliance with its commitments to the International Atomic Energy Agency.
Right.
All of Iran's enriched uranium is legal. Whatever Iran is doing right now, even if it enriches tomorrow at 99.999%, it is legal within the framework of the International Atomic Energy Agency and the NPT, as long as there's no deviation towards nuclear weapons. And there's never been any sign of that. So if they use the snapback provision, then in Iran they'll say, look, we cannot negotiate with these people. So it hurts those forces in Iran who believe that we should deal with the Americans and the Europeans and negotiate with them. But as I said, the UN Security Council resolutions today don't mean nearly as much as they did before. The Chinese and the Russians are not going, they're much stronger today. Their conflict with the United States has reached new heights. I don't think that they're going to say, okay, now that the snapback provisions have been implemented, or it's been carried out, and we have the UN Security Council's resolutions revived, we're no longer going to do A, B, C, or D with Iran.
I think Professor Marandi is pointing to an issue that goes well beyond Iran, and that is the increasingly selective approach to honoring or not honoring or ignoring United Nations Security Council resolutions. We've seen in the case of the various attempts to bring peace to the Holy Land between Palestinians and Israelis, that fundamental resolutions are now simply ignored by the United States. And indeed, the danger is that the Chinese and the Russians, who here up to now have been very respectful of Security Council resolutions because they see them as reflecting a multilateral order rather than the United States alone, that they may follow the United States in becoming selective about what they enforce and what they don't. And this would be fundamentally damaging to the world order in a way that we're already seeing in some respects. For example, the US approach to the World Trade Organization, which is essentially to ignore it and sabotage it. But others have the ability to do the same if they choose to, having and drawing on that precedent. So I think everyone should be very careful about setting precedents. If you go in and detach Kosovo from Serbia, then you're not in a position to say that the borders of Europe are sacrosanct and can't be changed when somebody else does something, like the Russians taking Crimea. So I think this is a very fundamental issue that we confront, and it mirrors the issues that Larry was referring to, and that is the defiance of court orders by the executive branch of the United States, the disregard of constitutional constraints, the erosion or indeed suspension of American freedoms. As we speak, there are 2 native-born American citizens held by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, despite the fact that they're Americans and that ICE has no jurisdiction over them. And there are court orders ordering them to release them, and they're being ignored. So we're seeing a breakdown of the rule of law domestically. How much can we now trust in the analog to the rule of law internationally?
And I point out, too, that the President of the United States has made statements that would lead you to believe that he would like to send our native-born citizen criminals to
Right.
foreign prisons.
And I think President Bukele would be happy to get paid
Yes.
to do
Yes. Cash on the barrel head.
it. Yeah.
Larry, what Professor Marandi and Ambassador Freeman said about the situation and the world has changed. We can see this right now in terms of, we know that in those days of JCPOA and the negotiations between Iran and the United States, Russia and China somehow were helping the United States in putting pressure on Iran. They're not in the same position and they were before. And the region, we know in those days, Saudi Arabia was fighting together with the United States, they were attacking Yemenis, Ansarullah. And right now, it's not the case anymore. Even with the tariffs in Europe, I don't see that Donald Trump has the upper hand to put pressure on Europe. How do you see, Larry? Do you think that they're considering what the position they're in right now?
I hope so, but I wouldn't guarantee you. Not from the rhetoric that's coming from people like Pete Hegseth and Marco Rubio and the president himself, of course, which is all over the map. But the people who are speaking for the administration, though they may be disparate voices, are not sane people, in my view, and not working from any strategic sheet of music. They're simply working, if they were working from anything, from the latest pronouncements Trump makes, and trying to make headway under those if they're doing anything positive at all. I think a huge problem we have right now is what others are telling me, and what I think Lisa Murkowski, we were talking about that before we went on the air, is hinting at. We're in significant danger here right now. And I mean significant danger, because he is and his acolytes are dismantling the very fabric of our republic. Now, they've proceeded apace with foreign relations. There's no question about that. They've made a mess of our security relationships in the world. And for all intents and purposes, I think it's fair to say they're going to continue and make them more profound and deepen them. At the same time, they're destroying freedoms here in this country. They're destroying free speech under the guise of anti-Semitism. And I listened to Speaker Johnson yesterday telling me what he's going to do about this 32 trillion or so aggregate debt right now. And at the same time he was saying that, he's not going to do anything about Social Security or Medicaid, or Medicare. Not going to interfere with any of those things. Well, where are you going to find the money, Mr. Speaker? This is nonsense. We have a bunch of people in leadership positions in our government right now who, in both foreign and security policy and domestic policy, are showing me that they are exactly what McGregor said they are, clowns. Or worse, they're intent on something that is not going to be too healthy for the republic, if not destructive thereof.
One of the problems that you can see, and I think this definitely affects the negotiations with Iran, which are the subject of our conversation today, but it's broader, is I don't think the administration has any genuine situational awareness. That is to say, it does not perceive the degree of anger that Europeans, for example, have developed toward the United States, the sense of betrayal that they are experiencing. Its handling of Mr. Zelensky, whatever you may think about Mr. Zelensky, was an example of a total lack of empathy. And its approach to Russia does not appear to rest on any understanding of Russian positions. We're seeing, of course, it's perfectly understandable why Ukraine would now welcome a ceasefire because it's losing the war. And it's perfectly understandable why the Russians, I think, would want to continue the war until they achieve the objectives they set for themselves, which they have been very careful in describing and which they have not wavered from. There's been no moving of the goalposts, really, in that war, unlike the way we do things, where we don't have clear objectives. And so I fear that we're capable on the, if you will, on the intelligence side, on the perception of reality side, of making terrible mistakes, and we're doing it. And I agree with Larry. I don't see how this stops.
And just to pick up on another point, if you're looking across the Atlantic, you see a man who is about to be, we think, the Chancellor of Germany, who's talking about sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine,
Exactly.
which changes the whole dynamic. These are very sophisticated missiles. They don't get any higher than 35 feet above the ground. They move at the speed of sound. The Russians probably do not have right now a countermeasure for them. They would probably develop one over time. But these missiles are designed and will have to be run by German technicians to go in and tear up targets that are, they're incredible missiles. They actually go in and climb as they get to their objective and come head down on them. The warhead will penetrate almost anything to a certain extent, normal concrete, rebar, things like that. And then it goes off inside whatever is penetrated. It's a very sophisticated missile. 150 to 160 of the 600 or so the Germans have, he's talking about sending to Ukraine. This is an escalation of the war. This is Germany in the war for all intents and purposes.
It's also us, because these missiles cannot be effectively targeted without our assistance.
Yeah.
The intelligence support is essential. So I agree with you, Larry. This is incredibly irresponsible on the part of Mr. Merz. And it is controversial in Germany. Not everyone agrees with this, thank God.
One thing that I'd just like to add, Nima, is that it wasn't as if the Russians and the Chinese were cooperating with the Americans and the Europeans to impose the UN Security Council resolutions. The Russians and the Chinese back then were weaker, and it was more difficult for them to resist the United States back then. So what they tried to do was they tried to water down the different resolutions, but ultimately they were forced to sign them because at that time the United States was still the hyperpower, and they were countries that were on the rise, but not where they are today. But there are a number of other things I think we also have to take into consideration, and that is that not only are these countries stronger today, but their relationships with Iran have evolved. The Iranians and the Russians, after Ukraine, the relationship has improved dramatically. I think everyone knows that. But the relationship between Iran and China after the tariff war has already shifted. It's already changed. And it was changing before that because the Chinese were anticipating the tariff war. So I don't believe that, for example, the United States, and I cannot swear to it, but I don't believe that the United States is going to be able to stop China from purchasing Iranian oil anymore. In fact, I think that the Chinese will probably be purchasing more Iranian oil than before if Iran has extra oil, because China wants to confront the United States. China is looking for allies and partners. And of course, in our region, the only country that is independent of the Western camp is Iran. So the Arabian Peninsula, Turkey, none of these countries are going to tilt towards China. They may do business with China, but they're not going to choose China over the United States. And they're all, as I said, they're already signs that the relationship between Iran and China have been changing over the past couple of weeks. That, and then in addition to that, I think you have a number of crises that are moving forward simultaneously. The tariff war will begin to have an impact inside the United States within a few weeks, within a few months. Let's say I heard 3 months from an economist today. Of course, I'm not an economist, so maybe another economist would say something different. But let's say 3 months is true. On the other hand, in by the end of May or the middle of May, the Russians, from what we're hearing from the Ukrainians, they are mobilizing. And if there's no peace, the Russians will possibly carry out larger assaults. So the war in Ukraine may intensify. The economic warfare being carried out will intensify. The impact will be felt. And then during this period of time, if the United States fails to behave reasonably towards the Iranians and the talks fail, then the Americans want to also possibly carry out an airstrikes against Iran under these circumstances. And then you have a huge divide, as was alluded to by Chaz and Larry before. You have the internal divide in the United States. Polls, except for on one or two issues, are not favorable towards Trump, even with regards to some of these issues of immigration. For example, the U.S. citizens who are being targeted, or green card holders. And this is becoming an issue in the United States. And while I don't approve of and I don't support Senator Sanders' position on Palestine and Israel, and I think it's completely inhumane. But right now, the reason why his rallies are so huge in states that are supportive of Trump is because there's rising discontent. So the months ahead could be very complicated, very messy, and I think it could be catastrophic for Trump.
If you saw the video the other day, yesterday, as a matter of fact, of Senator Grassley going back to a town hall meeting, and his constituents ate his lunch. He hardly could get a word in. They were furious over the job layoffs, over the farm bill. You might imagine Iowa's our biggest farming state. They were furious. I think he got a real dose. And I think that's happening across the country to a certain extent with a lot of these ripple out effects. People don't understand, for example, that of the million or so workers that are connected with or directly work for the DOD, many of them are out in the hustings. They're not in Washington. And these people are being laid off, or they're worried about their jobs, and they're Republicans, and they're reporting back. And this is just going to pick up steam as it goes along, as you said.
Well, there is a saying, Professor Marandi, that if you put all the economists in the world, line them all up, they still couldn't come to a conclusion.
That's right.
So I don't know about how long it's going to take, but it's very clear that the president is typically misdescribing reality when he says that we're getting rich, prices are coming down. This is not what is happening. We have the same issue, I fear, in the Sino-American trade war, where the president says that we're in direct negotiations with the Chinese, but the Chinese don't agree that they are. I think they are in contact with us because they believe that, as I do, that sound diplomacy, like warfare, requires you always to maintain contact with the enemy. If you don't, you get surprised, you get flanked. So they have maintained contact with us, but my sense is that they have no intention of dealing with Mr. Trump for all of the reasons of erratic behavior and previous experiences that we've all discussed. So I think we're having a domestic meltdown. I agree. I don't know on what time scale, but we're also having a meltdown in our international relationships. Tourism in the United States has collapsed as a result of the conjunction of these two factors. And we're coming up on a new academic year in terms of foreign student admissions. I think we're going to see a dramatic drop-off. The universities are under attack by the administration. Now they will lose much of the revenue they've depended upon because it's foreign students who pay full freight at universities, not domestic students for the most part. So a lot of things are coming together, and I think we'll see how the Trump administration deals with them. My fear is that it will deal with them harshly, in an authoritarian manner. It will double down on the essential dictatorship that is being put in place. And we've seen, Larry mentioned people being laid off. We have I call it the Department of Government Incapacitation, which is ripping into everybody with a chainsaw. So I think there's a big backlash. And I would note last Saturday, there were 5 million people came out on the streets in the 50-51 movement to protest against the Trump policies. I suspect tomorrow there will be many more than 5 million. The weather's better, people are more annoyed, and I think there is opposition building that in the end must have some effect. Even Mr. Trump had to surrender to the bond market when it went haywire.
Professor Marandi, if we assume that the best case scenario for Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, if they're capable of putting pressure on Europe the way that they're just Europe getting in line with the United States with the snapback sanctions, how do you see the feeling that comes to the Iranian officials? Because what would be the meaning of NPT for Iran then? What would be the meaning of IAEA inspectors in Iran? Are they talking about these things in Iran?
Well, at the moment, there's not a lot of talk about the sanctions and the snapback. But obviously, if the Europeans and the Americans move in that direction, history has told us that the Iranians are going to move in the opposite direction. They will, I have no doubt, they'll put extra money into the nuclear program. They'll expand the nuclear program. They'll expand enrichment. They'll create new installations, new underground facilities. And these facilities, by the way, are not something that the Americans can destroy. The Americans can destroy, even if B-2 bombers and B-52 bombers bomb the nuclear installations. The key components of the installations cannot be destroyed by, I'm not even sure if nuclear weapons can destroy them, but they definitely cannot be destroyed by conventional weapons. The reason why, for example, last night, Trump carried out a really brutal and genocidal attack on Al-Hodeidah, and he bombed the port, killing workers and port staff, and then killing medics and first responders who came to help them. It was a horrific attack, and you don't hear about it in the Western media. But it had nothing to do with Ansarullah. It had nothing to do with the Yemeni armed forces. But the reason why they're carrying out these atrocities is the same as Israel. Why are the Israelis murdering ordinary people in Gaza? Because they failed against the resistance. In Yemen, the Americans have been bombing Ansarullah bases, but they have failed to penetrate them because they're deep underground. They've been built in the first place to be protected from U.S. airstrikes, to be protected from anything that the Saudis or the Americans can throw at them. So the Iranians would simply, if there was a move towards snapback, the Iranians would simply expand their nuclear program, cooperate less with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And as I said earlier, the impact would be very minimal. It will not have the Americans already have sanctioned everything. It's called maximum pressure sanctions for a reason, because they cannot do anything more than what they're doing already. The sanctions against Iran are even more extensive than the sanctions against Russia, because They need Russia to be able to export some oil. They need Russia to be able to export some gas. They've attempted to shut down all Iranian exports over the last decade. And Biden, by the way, never removed the maximum pressure sanctions. So if we go back to if those UN Security Council resolutions are revived, it won't have a huge impact on Iran. In those areas where it could have an impact, my belief is that the Russians and probably the Chinese will ignore them. And increasingly, so will countries in the region. You pointed out to something important earlier, and that is the region. Both Larry and Chaz, they know the other side of the Persian Gulf much better than I. Chaz was an ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and of course, Larry was the chief of staff of the Secretary of State. The attitude in the Persian Gulf region is very different today from what it was a decade or a decade and a half ago. Back then, they were egging on conflict with Iran. Now they're terrified of conflict with Iran. And one final point is that if the United States strikes Iran, Iran will strike back, but it will strike at Israel very hard. And it has the ability to really hurt Israel very badly. And they've held back for a host of reasons, which maybe on another occasion we can discuss that. But it will not go well for Israel. It will not go well for the region. It will not go well for the world. And by the way, one of the few things that Trump is boasting about right now is the decline in energy prices, and I think maybe eggs. But if there is conflict, I don't know what will happen to the price of eggs, but I assure everyone that the price of energy will go through the roof.
Of course.
Neiman, let me just say that there is no more, as a military professional, there would be no more opportune time to attack Israel right now, because Israel has got its plate so full that I contemplate the next 30 to 45 days, either Netanyahu is going to be assassinated or he's going to have to step down. That doesn't mean a good guy is going to come in, but that's how bad it's getting in Israel. If you've been following all these letters that are coming from every element in the security complex, everyone's angry with him for different reasons, but they're all angry with him. And they have bitten off more than they can chew. In Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza, in the West Bank, they've bitten off more than they can chew. The IDF itself is coming apart.
Let me add
moment to attack.
if I can add something on the Persian Gulf dimension of this. There has been a contest for influence in West Asia between Iran and the Gulf Arabs, and it's played out in many contexts. Israel has basically ended most of that conflict by decimating Hezbollah, by removing Iran from Syria. It has subdued for Saudi Arabia the concerns that it had about Iranian hegemony in the region. And on the other hand, people in the Gulf, and particularly the Saudis, are now very concerned about Israeli behavior, and the menace of Israel, and what it would mean if Israel started a war in the region. And so I have been watching, and I think I am seeing, and I believe Khalid bin Salman's visit to Tehran is a symptom of this, the gradual emergence of a coalition between Iran and the Gulf Arabs directed at balancing Israel, and by extension, attenuating dependence on the United States by those that Professor Marandi correctly described as in the Western camp in the region. They're not so much in the Western camp now.
Wow.
And that is a change. And you can see this, to go back to the mechanics of an attack on Iran, everything concentrated in Diego Garcia. Why? Because the countries in the region don't want to be part of any attack on Iran.
No. And I think it's important to note there are 3 files where the Saudis and the Iranians can cooperate. One is Syria, The
Yes.
Saudis are very worried. They're not happy with the Turks, and they're not happy with the Israeli regime. Lebanon, if the Saudis and the Iranians can work together in Lebanon, the divide that exists between Hezbollah and the government would be resolved, and that would strengthen the resistance. And Yemen. And so all of these would be very bad signs. And as Chaz rightly points out, these countries are in the Western camp, but the world is changing very rapidly. And while they're still closer to the United States than the Chinese, to Russia or to Iran, but with the behavior that we're seeing in Washington, and also the behavior of the Israeli regime, it's in 2010, it was everyone. I think most people thought that this region was nice and quiet, most in the West, and just before October the 7th, we saw Jake Sullivan say something quite similar again. But then in Tunisia, when some young man burned himself alive, not in the capital, but because of a local grievance, we saw ultimately that the whole region was in uproar, and governments collapsed, and regimes were removed. That could now happen again. The situation today across West Asia and North Africa is much worse. People are outraged by what's going on in Gaza. The economic situation is definitely not any better. The trade war is going to impact the whole world, by the way. It's going to make it. I mean, the countries like Iran are probably going to be least affected. Iran, Cuba, those who are sanctioned, who are not a part of this global system, they'll be the least affected. But the situation is not good. So Saudi Arabia I think, is making a smart move by trying to, and this was a big move. The son of the king, the brother of the crown prince, the minister of defense, coming to Iran, and then the leader receiving him. Usually, a minister of defense does not meet the leader. So I think that this is a sign that U.S. influence in the region is decreasing. The capability for I'm not saying realignment; it's too early for that. But for an evolving relationship is very potential evolving relationship is very bad for the Israeli regime, and it's bad for Trump.
Nima, we're seeing exactly what several of us predicted some years ago. I, in very graphic terms, Israel is a strategic liability, not a strategic asset. And it's being proven right now, day by day, hour by hour.
That's a reminder that we should all take note of, that to make a defense commitment to someone else makes them a liability, unless they bring such impressive strength to your cause that they aggregate their power to you and you're better off. But that is emphatically not the case with Israel, and it never has been.
Professor
I think
Marandi,
that's something the Zionist lobby in the United States should take into account, because even in the United States, people are seeing that who's behind the arrests, who's behind the harassment of protesters, who's behind the immigration issue for American citizens and others who are legally in the United States, and who is, as Jeffrey Sachs that clip of his, which Trump himself reposted, who has caused all these wars for the United States. The rest of the world has turned against the Israeli regime. The globe and the region in particular is outraged. But even in the United States, we saw the recent polls where the majority of Americans have turned against the Israeli regime. And if the situation in the United States continues as it is, and if the situation economically speaking deteriorates as well, people are increasingly going to come to this conclusion that the Israeli regime is a liability. It's a burden, as rightly pointed out. None of this is good news for the Israelis. So they can cheer on the U.S. Air Force to bomb a place in Iran. If, of course, those pilots may be killed or captured too. But ultimately, there will be blowback. And I think people increasingly in the United States, ordinary people, they're going to be pointing fingers at the Zionist lobby, the Israeli regime, and nothing is forever.
We can all, I think we all agree that we can expect a rise in discontent in the United States. You've put your finger on one element of it, which is that some elements of the Jewish communities in the United States have become ardent attackers of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the right to petition the government for the redress of wrongs, and other rights that Americans take seriously and believe in. But I think there's another element here, and that is, I love the phrase that Rana Farouhar came up with the other day when she described our system as Caligula capitalism. And that is taking its toll too.
Yeah. Professor Marandi, before wrapping up this session, I think the other thing that was so much important was the letter from the supreme leader of Iran to Russian president. And what does that mean in your opinion?
Well, I'll keep it short because Larry was speaking and I interrupted him. Mm-hmm. So I'll leave the last word for Larry. But I think it reinforces what we've been talking about. The relationship between Iran and Russia has reached new heights. And if you look at the history of the relationship, we never had good relations with the Russians historically. We have a pretty poor history with the Russians. In fact, they occupied parts of our country and they've taken away other parts of our country. So it took a very long. It would take hundreds of years to fix that, and it sort of reminds me of Iraq. Under normal conditions, it would take hundreds of years to fix that. It reminds me of Iraq. I fought in the war in Iraq. And so hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and Iranians fought, more than maybe hundreds of thousands. People lost sons, husbands, children, parents. After the war, and even after the fall of Saddam Hussein, when I would travel to Iraq, or when others would go, they would speak about friction that existed between Iranians and Iraqis at the airport, at shops, in different places. But after ISIS invaded Iraq, the ISIS that Mr. Erdogan and NATO and Qatar and others were funding, after they invaded Iraq and the Iranians went to the aid of the Iraqis and they fought together, the relationship between Iranians and Iraqis changed completely. I mean, there's always friction between different people. It's normal, but the relationship, the past literally disappeared. And what the United States has succeeded in doing between Iran and Russia is to create a relationship where the shadow of the past isn't that visible anymore.
Larry.
Oh, it's extraordinary what we've done in the world to increase the power of our erstwhile enemies. You can't pick a spot other than perhaps Tokyo, Japan. You can't pick Korea. You can't pick Taiwan either. But you can't find a spot where we haven't enhanced the depth of our jeopardy. It's incredible when you think about it. And what worries me too about that very thing coming down to a microcosmic example that could become cataclysmic, Netanyahu will do anything to survive. If he doesn't get his war with Iran, he'll make one. Then what do we do?
Ambassador, before wrapping up, do you have something to add?
No, I think that sums it up. This has been a delightful optimistic conversation.
Thank you so much for being with us today. Great pleasure to have you on. As always.
Thank you very much for
Take care.
having me.
Thanks for having us.